Crises have shadowed humanity from the very beginning. Living on a planet capable of earthquakes, storms, and diseases, and belonging to a species that wages war and inflicts harm, people have always confronted danger. As human groups developed organized societies, these crises demanded a new response, recognition and guidance from a political leader. This was first evidenced in ancient Greece. It was in Athens that democracy was born and first put to the test. Previously, people had been ruled by monarchs, tyrants, and oligarchic regimes. Within these systems of governing, there is almost no need for leaders to appeal to their citizens. Aside from an avoidance of revolution, the opinions and concerns of the people did not have much impact on the actions of the government. This means fostering unity and peace of mind were not an influential factor to leaders when addressing the crisis. It is in Athens in the 4th and 5th centuries BCE that we see rhetoric begin to flourish. Athens was the hotspot for new ideas, great minds, and advances in rhetoric. One of the earliest examples of a true crisis address emerges from this period, Pericles' funeral oration during the Peloponnesian War. Although delivered as part of a public burial ritual, the speech responded directly to national fear and uncertainty, offering reassurance, unity, and justification for continued sacrifice. Once political leaders became dependent on citizen approval, they were compelled to craft speeches that could steady public emotion during moments of danger. The funeral oration, therefore, stands as one of the earliest recorded examples of crisis rhetoric functioning within a democratic society. In her graduate thesis, Samantha D. Cart discusses this debate and its implications on the genre of crisis address speeches. She wrote, "If indeed one of the main purposes of rhetoric is to persuade, as according to Plato, then it is obvious that rhetoric plays a huge role in politics. Audiences can simply hear a political candidate speak and not be able to pinpoint the reasons why they feel supportive of that candidate afterwards. Due to this persuasion over the listeners, it is important for leaders in a democratic society to effectively write and use crisis address speeches to retain favor and secure their reputation within the voter community. It is very important to ensure you use a crisis to make your standing stronger, not allow it to weaken you. This desire is what established the rhetorical patterns we will be examining in the genre." Jumping forward in time to March 12, 1933, only 8 days after Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidential inauguration, America was suffering through the lowest point of the Great Depression. Between 25 and 33% of workers were unemployed. People were desperate, and families were struggling under immense financial strain. President Roosevelt decided it was time to address the public in what would later be known as his fireside chats. At this point, there was a radio in 90% of American homes. This new medium fundamentally changed the relationship between presidents and citizens. As one historian explains, the primacy of radio as a source of entertainment and news gave President Roosevelt an opportunity no U.S. president had yet had, to speak directly to broad sections of the American public without having his message filtered through the press. Live radio, by contrast, left no room for misquotation. For the first time, a president could reach millions instantly and deliver his crisis response exactly as he intended, unmediated, personal, and consistent. While radio had been used to varying extents by earlier presidents to communicate with the public, Roosevelt adopted a distinctly new approach. Understanding the intense fear Americans were experiencing, he sought to calm the nation and create a shared sense of hope and camaraderie. His speeches, which ranged from 13 to 45 minutes, used a remarkably informal and reassuring tone. He explained complex issues, including why the banks had failed, how the New Deal would work, the nature of labor strikes, and rising international tensions in Europe before the start of World War II. He addressed all of this in language that felt accessible and intimate. Most importantly, he offered reassurance and asked Americans to trust in the banking system and the economy once again. One historian noted, "The sense of connection with the president was immediate. A flood of letters from citizens across the country inundated the White House mailroom in the months after the first on-air address, most expressing strong support for the president's words." It was the soothing, conversational style adopted by Roosevelt that made his chats so impactful. Listeners felt like there was a personal connection between them and their president. The nature of these chats and FDR's rhetorical system of speech endeared him greatly to people during his time as president. It was an incredibly effective strategy for maintaining his public perception as well as unifying and providing his listeners with peace of mind. Through his rhetorical strategy, he succeeded in gaining people's trust during a time of great crisis. In August of 1945, America was facing an even greater disaster. It was near the end of World War II. Japan was still fighting despite everyone knowing they had lost. President Harry Truman was forced to decide how to end the war. He chose to drop the newly created atomic bomb on Japan to force them to finally surrender. What happened in Hiroshima? 80,000 people were dead and 35,000 more injured, and the city no longer existed. In America, President Truman addressed the people.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima.
In his address, he began with an explanation of what had occurred in Hiroshima and alluded back to how the Japanese had started this war in Pearl Harbor. Truman then informs the people about what the atomic bomb is, stating,
"It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East."
This speech has a more objective and factual tone than the fireside chats. In the face of the great and terrible power America had created and used in Japan, Truman was attempting to justify its use and introduce the concept of weapons of mass destruction to the people, while assuring that every action would be taken against Japan to make them surrender. Truman crafted a crisis address in which he notified the public about the invention and use of the atom bomb, as well as creating assurances that the war with Japan would be brought to an end. This rhetorical structure properly addressed the gravity of the situation.
The air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid manyfold.
NBC News brings to you from the White House in Washington an address by President Kennedy declared to be officially of the highest national urgency.
On October 22, 1962, President John F. Kennedy delivered an address to the people announcing the presence of Soviet missiles on the island of Cuba. Kennedy was a skilled orator. He enlisted rhetorical strategies that gave his speeches great persuasive power. He was very practiced and effective in the art of speaking. Kennedy was often called the first true televised president. The medium shaped his rhetoric, making clarity and emotional steadiness just as important as the words themselves. These skills were exemplified in his speech addressing the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world was suddenly confronting the possibility of nuclear war. From the television screen, Kennedy addressed millions waiting anxiously to hear how this may impact their futures. Kennedy understood this crisis demanded lots. It required a new form of presidential communication, one that blended moral authority, legal justification, and a calm, strategic reasoning. His messages had to serve multiple audiences, from fearful U.S. citizens and the global public to NATO and the Soviet leaders themselves. He began clearly explaining the threat.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba.
He provided the nation with reconnaissance photographs, the capabilities of the missiles, and the danger they posed. This was a very unusual level of transparency for a president, yet Kennedy used this intelligence to build trust with the people and show them exactly why they needed to act. Just as impactful as his decision to be honest was his restraint. He could have chosen to launch an airstrike or invasion, but instead he announced naval quarantine. This decision showed that he was standing strong, but not escalating the situation. It became an example of what calm, disciplined leadership can do in a moment of crisis. Kennedy's address ultimately set the standard for modern crisis rhetoric. By combining transparency, strategic restraint, and moral clarity, he created a model for how presidents communicate in times of extreme danger. His Cuban Missile Crisis speech marks a turning point for the evolution of crisis addresses, proof that in the nuclear age, the right words spoken at the right moment can help pull the world back from the edge.
Mr. Speaker, the members of the President's Cabinet.
On March 15, 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson stepped before a joint session of Congress to address a very different kind of national crisis. This time, the danger wasn't foreign missiles or a global war. It was the violence and injustice unfolding within America's own borders. The attacks on peaceful civil rights marchers in Selma, Alabama, had shocked the nation, and Johnson recognized that the country was facing a domestic emergency that demanded decisive moral leadership. television once again played a transformative role in shaping crisis rhetoric. Just as Roosevelt had used radio and Kennedy had mastered televised diplomacy, Johnson understood the emotional power of the camera. Millions of Americans watched him deliver his speech live, witnessing his solemn expression and steady, deliberate tone. In this speech, Johnson extended the use of crisis rhetoric not only as a tool for foreign threats, but also as a way to confront internal injustice. He framed the fight for civil rights as a national emergency that demanded the full weight of presidential authority. Johnson drew on history, morality, and religious imagery to reach Americans across political and regional divides. When he echoed the words of the civil rights movement,
"And we shall overcome,"
he aligned the presidency with a moral cause rather than a military one. The impact of this speech extended far beyond that night in Congress. Johnson's message helped propel the Voting Rights Act forward and showed that crisis rhetoric could be used not only to defend the nation, but also to repair it. His address set a precedent for future presidents facing domestic turmoil, demonstrating that moments of internal conflict require the same clarity, courage, and moral conviction as international crises. In doing so, Johnson reshaped the rhetorical landscape, proving that the struggle for justice at home can be just as urgent as the threats from abroad.